August 6, 1945. At exactly 8:15 a.m., a blinding light splits the skies over Hiroshima. For a moment, there is no sound, only a white flash that swallows the horizon. Then the shockwave comes, ripping through buildings, turning glass into blades, flesh into ash. In less than a minute, tens of thousands are gone. By nightfall, the city is a shadow of itself, burning in a silence broken only by the cries of the injured. For most of history, the explanation has been simple. The United States dropped the atomic bomb to end the war with Japan, fast, decisively, and without the bloodbath of a mainland invasion. It is the story written into textbooks, echoed in speeches, and memorialized in war documentaries. But behind closed doors in Washington, the truth was never so straightforward. Some of the men who made the decision saw Japan as only part of the equation. Their eyes were already on a different map, one where the next great war might begin before the ink was dry on the surrender papers. In the summer of 1945, the United States and the Soviet Union were still officially allies, but the warmth of that alliance was fading fast. American intelligence knew that Joseph Stalin's armies were massing on the borders of Japanese-held Manchuria, poised to invade. If they moved quickly enough, the Soviets could claim territory in Asia, just as they had in Eastern Europe. For President Harry Truman and his closest advisors, the atomic bomb was more than a weapon. It was a message, a demonstration of power so overwhelming it might not only end the war in the Pacific, but also freeze Soviet ambitions before they began. And yet, on paper, the reasoning was wrapped in different language. Military planners spoke of casualty projections, hundreds of thousands of American dead if the invasion of Japan went ahead. They spoke of Japan's stubborn refusal to surrender, even after cities had been burned to the ground by conventional bombing. They spoke of saving lives. But behind those public words lay private calculations. In meeting rooms from Potsdam to Washington, officials weighed not just the destruction of Japan, but the shape of the post-war order. The bomb would not only force Tokyo to the table, it would set the tone for the next half-century of global politics. The decision to use the bomb was a crossroads moment. On one path, a costly invasion, a drawn-out siege, perhaps even Soviet occupation of parts of Japan. On the other, a new and terrifying technology, untested on a living city, that could end the war overnight, and announce to the world that the United States now held the most powerful weapon in history. What few in 1945 could imagine was how much that second path would change the future. The flash over Hiroshima was not just the end of one war, it was the first shot of the Cold War. Still, in the official story told to the public, the Soviet Union barely figured at all. Truman's statement the day of the bombing focused on Pearl Harbor, Japanese atrocities, and the hope for swift peace. The headlines the next morning carried words like victory and revenge, not geopolitical warning. For decades, the deeper motives stayed buried in archives and memoirs. Only later would historians piece together the cables, diaries, and minutes of tense meetings that revealed a more complex truth. The atomic bomb was aimed at Japan, but its echo was meant for Moscow. The men who ordered the mission over Hiroshima could not have predicted every consequence. They did not know it would trigger an arms race that would place humanity under the shadow of annihilation for generations. They did not foresee the decades of secrecy, denial, and moral debate that would follow. What they did know, what they had calculated, was that history's first use of nuclear weapons would send a signal that reached far beyond the Pacific. The world remembers the mushroom cloud, but the real reason it rose into the sky that morning is a story far more complicated than the one we have been told. And that is where our journey begins. By the summer of 1945, the Second World War was, in Europe, already over. Berlin had fallen, Hitler was dead, and the Third Reich had surrendered in May. But across the Pacific, the fighting showed no signs of mercy or pause. Japan's empire was shrinking, yet its armies and navy were still lethal, still dug in, still ready to kill and die for the emperor. The United States had been at war for nearly 4 years. Its military machine was at full throttle, churning out ships, planes, tanks, and weapons on a scale never before seen. But every mile of ocean and every captured island had been bought at staggering cost. The island of Okinawa had fallen only weeks earlier, after nearly 3 months of combat. More than 12,000 Americans were dead. Japanese military losses were far higher, and civilian casualties were catastrophic. Tens of thousands killed in the crossfire, in mass suicides, in the relentless shelling. Kamikaze pilots had turned the seas into a graveyard of burning ships. Okinawa was meant to be a preview of what an invasion of Japan's home islands could look like, and it chilled even the most hardened commanders. Planners estimated that taking Kyushu and Honshu could cost 500,000 American casualties or more, plus millions of Japanese dead. No one knew how long it would take, or how much it would drain a nation already weary of war. Meanwhile, the home front in the United States was shifting. Victory in Europe brought celebration, but also the expectation that the boys would be coming home. Families counted the months. Industry wondered how long it could keep producing at wartime speed. Politicians, too, were impatient. They wanted the Pacific War wrapped up quickly, before public support began to fade. But Japan showed no signs of surrender. Allied firebombing campaigns had reduced many of its cities to rubble. Tokyo itself had been devastated in March, in a single night of fire that killed more than 80,000 people. Still, the military clique that ruled the country refused to give up. To them, surrender was unthinkable unless the emperor's position was guaranteed and their honor preserved. In Washington, this stalemate was becoming intolerable. Every week the war dragged on meant more American lives lost, and every week gave the Soviet Union time to position itself for influence in Asia. Joseph Stalin had promised at Yalta to enter the war against Japan 3 months after Germany's defeat. By the calendar, that meant August 1945. U.S. leaders understood what that meant. Once the Red Army moved, they could seize territory in Manchuria, Korea, and perhaps even northern Japan. The same Soviet expansionism that had swept through Eastern Europe could now reach into the Pacific. And so, the stakes were no longer just about ending one war. They were about shaping the world that would follow. Truman and his advisors wanted a Japan occupied solely by American forces, a Japan that could be rebuilt in America's image, and a Japan that would stand as a democratic bulwark against communism in Asia. To achieve that, the war had to end before Soviet troops arrived in force. That meant forcing Japan's surrender in a matter of days or weeks, not months. In this tense summer, the Manhattan Project was nearing completion. For nearly 3 years, scientists and engineers had worked in secrecy to create the most destructive weapon in history. Vast factories in Oak Ridge, Hanford, and Los Alamos had consumed billions of dollars and countless tons of raw material, all for a device that had never been tested on a real target. Now, the test was imminent, and for some in Washington, its purpose was no longer purely military, it was political. End the war with Japan, yes, but also end it in such a way that the United States, not the Soviet Union, emerged as the sole military superpower. The stage was set. Japan was cornered but unbroken. The Soviets were moving into position, and in the deserts of New Mexico, the world's first atomic bomb was nearly ready to fire. But the first sparks of this decision had been lit long before the bomb was built, and long before Hiroshima's name was known to the world. The sea off Okinawa is black with smoke. It is April 1945, and the U.S. Navy's largest amphibious assault of the Pacific War is underway. On a rain-slick morning, Marines crouch in their landing craft, rifles clutched tight, the roar of naval guns shaking the air. Ahead, the island's ridges are alive with fire, Japanese shells screaming down toward the beaches. On the decks of destroyers offshore, sailors watch the sky for the sudden glint of incoming death. The kamikazes come without warning, their engines shrieking as they plunge through anti-aircraft fire. One strikes the USS Bush, detonating in a fireball that turns steel into shrapnel. Survivors are hurled into the oil-slicked water, clinging to debris as explosions echo across the waves. On the ground, every yard is contested. Caves hide machine gun nests, hills become fortresses. Civilians are caught in the crossfire, entire families huddled in caves, suffocating from smoke, or leaping from cliffs rather than face capture. By the time Okinawa falls in June, the U.S. has suffered over 49,000 casualties, more than 12,000 of them dead. Japanese losses are far greater, soldiers, civilians, all consumed in the battle's furnace. For American commanders, the lesson is unmistakable. If this is the fight for one island, what will it cost to take the Japanese home islands themselves? The answer is unthinkable. It is in the shadow of Okinawa's carnage that the search for alternatives intensifies, and where the atomic bomb, still a weapon of theory, begins to look like a way to end the war without repeating this nightmare. In a quiet, secure room in the Pentagon in the spring of 1945, a handful of men gather around a table scattered with maps of Japan. They are members of the Target Committee, scientists, military planners, and intelligence officers entrusted with a grim task: deciding which cities will be erased from the map. The discussions are clinical, almost detached. The criteria are laid out in cold, precise terms. The target must be large enough for the bomb's power to be measured. It must be militarily significant. It must not have been heavily damaged by previous bombing so that the full effect of the atomic blast can be observed. Hiroshima appears early on the list, a city of military headquarters, supply depots, and shipyards, ringed by mountains that could amplify the bomb's destructive force. Kyoto, with its historic shrines and cultural heritage, is considered but later spared at the insistence of Secretary of War Henry Stimson, who argues passionately to protect Japan's cultural heart. Nagasaki is not the first choice for a second strike, but its naval industry and layout fit the committee's needs. The men speak of psychological impact, of demonstrating power, not only to Japan, but to the world. They debate the timing, one bomb or two in rapid succession. Would a single strike compel surrender, or would the second be necessary to prove the first was no fluke? These decisions are made far from the front lines, but they will determine the fate of hundreds of thousands. On the maps before them, the chosen cities are just circles in pencil. In reality, they are full of lives, each about to be placed in history's crosshairs. On the night of March 9, 1945, the people of Tokyo go to sleep under a sky that seems calm. Then, just after midnight, the hum of engines builds over the city. Hundreds of American B-29 bombers sweep in low, their bomb bays crammed with clusters of napalm-filled canisters. The first explosions tear open the night. Then the fire spreads. Napalm sticks to everything it touches: wood, tile, flesh, igniting with a heat so intense that the air itself seems to burn. Within minutes, firestorms roar through entire districts, the flames feeding on the tightly packed wooden houses. The wind pulls oxygen into the inferno, turning narrow streets into tunnels of fire. People run toward the rivers, believing water will save them, but the bridges are choked with bodies and the heat boils the surface. Mothers clutch children as they leap in, vanishing in steam. By dawn, much of Tokyo's ease. Turn wards are gone. More than 80,000 are dead. Some estimates say over 100,000, making it the single deadliest air raid of the war, deadlier even than Hiroshima or Nagasaki. 1 million are homeless. And yet, Japan does not surrender. The military leadership speaks of sacrifice, of honor, of fighting to the last. Civilians dig through rubble, rebuild homes of scraps, and try to live another day under the constant threat of more raids. For U.S. leaders, Tokyo's ashes are proof that conventional bombing, no matter how devastating, cannot break Japan's will. If entire cities can be burned to the ground without ending the war, then a different kind of destruction may be the only way to force a surrender. 3 years earlier, in 1942, the Manhattan Project began as a desperate gamble, an effort to build an atomic bomb before Nazi Germany could do the same. By 1945, Germany was defeated, but the project had grown into one of the most ambitious scientific and industrial undertakings in history. Across the United States, entire secret cities had sprung up: Oak Ridge in Tennessee, Hanford in Washington, and the remote mesa of Los Alamos in New Mexico. Tens of thousands of workers toiled around the clock, most with no idea what they were building. Scientists and engineers navigated the razor's edge between theory and catastrophe, refining uranium-235 and producing plutonium in quantities never before imagined. At Los Alamos, physicist J. Robert Oppenheimer led a team of the world's brightest minds in designing two distinct weapons: the gun-type uranium bomb, nicknamed Little Boy, and the implosion-type plutonium bomb, Fat Man. The complexity was staggering: shaping explosives to compress plutonium evenly, crafting detonators precise to the microsecond, building bomb casings that could survive the drop and detonate in mid-air. Every day was a race against time. Rumors swirled that Japan might be seeking its own nuclear program, or that the Soviets might try to infiltrate the project through espionage. Security was so tight that even high-ranking military officers could be denied access without proper clearance. By mid-1945, the bomb was almost ready, but not yet proven. To the scientists, the question was whether it would work at all. To the military, the question was how fast it could be deployed. And to some in Washington, the question was how this weapon might change not just the war, but the world's balance of power. In the spring of 1945, Allied leaders still spoke of unity, but the alliance between Washington, London, and Moscow was already fraying. Germany's defeat had revealed a hard truth. Joseph Stalin's vision for the post-war world was not the same as Franklin Roosevelt's, or Harry Truman's. At Yalta in February, Stalin had promised to enter the war against Japan within 3 months of Germany's surrender. True to his word, Soviet forces in Siberia began massing for an assault on Japanese-occupied Manchuria. To American planners, this was a double-edged sword. On one hand, Soviet intervention could further weaken Japan's position. On the other, it risked giving Moscow a foothold in East Asia, perhaps even a claim on Japanese territory. The U.S. had seen what Soviet liberation meant in Eastern Europe: swift occupation, political takeovers, and the spread of communist governments aligned with Moscow. The fear in Washington was that the same pattern could unfold in Asia, placing huge swaths of the Pacific under Soviet influence. Harry Truman, who had taken office after Roosevelt's death in April, was briefed on the Manhattan Project just days into his presidency. As he learned of the bomb's potential, a strategic calculation began to take shape. If the United States could end the war, before the Soviets entered, Japan could be occupied solely by American forces. The political and ideological future of the Pacific would then be written in Washington, not Moscow. In this light, the atomic bomb was not only a military tool, it was a diplomatic one, and its first audience, some believed, would not be in Tokyo at all, but in the Kremlin. In the summer of 1945, deep inside a nondescript building in Washington, U.S., codebreakers sifted through streams of intercepted Japanese communications. The work, known as magic, had already helped turn the tide of the war in the Pacific. Now, as the conflict neared its climax, it revealed something Washington had not expected: cracks in Japan's leadership. Encrypted cables between Tokyo and its diplomatic envoys hinted at a divided high command. Some military leaders insisted on fighting to the bitter end, but others, particularly Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo, were quietly exploring ways to end the war. The most promising route, it seemed, was through the Soviet Union, which had not yet declared war on Japan. Messages spoke of using Moscow as a mediator, offering concessions in exchange for peace, but these overtures were cautious, conditional, and vague. Crucially, they did not suggest unconditional surrender, the Allies' stated demand since 1943. For U.S. leaders, this was proof that Japan was not yet ready to yield on terms they could accept. Still, the intelligence was clear. Japan's resolve was not absolute. There was room for diplomacy, though it might require patience. The question was whether the United States was willing to wait, especially with the Soviets poised to enter the war. To men like Secretary of State James Burns, the answer was no. Every day's delay risked Soviet forces marching into northern Japan or Korea. A swift, decisive blow might not only end the war on America's terms, but also deny Stalin any seat at the table in Tokyo. The cables told one story, the clock told another, and Washington was listening to the clock. By mid-1945, the American public had been at war for nearly 4 years. Families had endured rationing, long separations, and the dreaded telegrams edged in black. Victory in Europe had brought a wave of celebration, but also a growing impatience. The war in the Pacific had to end, and soon. The U.S. government understood the stakes. Public morale had to remain high enough to sustain one final push, no matter the cost. Posters, newsreels, and radio broadcasts hammered home a consistent message: Japan was ruthless, treacherous, and would never surrender willingly. Every battle, from Iwo Jima to Okinawa, was presented as proof of the enemy's fanaticism. Images of kamikaze pilots smiling before their suicide missions circulated in newspapers. Headlines emphasized Japanese atrocities in China, the Philippines, and prisoner of war camps. The goal was clear: to make the American people believe that nothing short of total destruction could bring victory. This narrative left little room for negotiation. If Japan was portrayed as a foe that would fight to the death, then diplomacy appeared naive, dangerous even. The idea of accepting any compromise short of unconditional surrender was painted as a betrayal of the sacrifices already made. By the summer, the possibility of using the atomic bomb fit neatly into this framework. It was cast not as an act of desperation or intimidation, but as the logical final blow in a war that demanded nothing less than complete triumph. In the public mind, total victory was the only victory war worth having, and in Washington, leaders were shaping events to make sure that was exactly the outcome the nation would accept. By the summer of 1945, the U.S. economy had become a war machine of unprecedented scale. Factories turned out aircraft, tanks, and munitions day and night. Shipyards along both coasts launched new vessels every week. Farms fed millions of troops overseas, as well as a home front still under rationing. But this pace came at a cost. The war in Europe was over, and with it, some of the urgency driving production. Workers were already dreaming of peacetime jobs. Soldiers were counting the days until they could return home, and politicians faced pressure to bring the war to a close before morale and economic momentum began to erode. Military planners were blunt. Continuing the Pacific Campaign into 1946 or beyond would demand staggering resources. The invasion of Japan's home islands, Operation Downfall, would require thousands of ships, millions of tons of supplies, and hundreds of thousands of fresh troops. Each month of delay would consume billions of dollars and stretch logistics to the breaking point. The strain was not just financial. Shipping lanes were under constant threat from Japan's remaining submarines. Fuel demands for the Navy and Air Force were enormous. Stockpiles of ammunition and spare parts had to be replenished faster than they were being used. In this context, the atomic bomb promised more than a military shortcut. It offered an economic one. A single decisive strike might save not just lives, but vast sums of money and resources, allowing the United States to pivot rapidly to post-war recovery. The longer the war dragged on, the more it looked less like a final chapter, and more like a war without end. In July 1945, the leaders of the Allied powers met in the quiet suburb of Potsdam, just outside Berlin. The war in Europe was over, but the fate of the Pacific and the shape of the post-war world still hung in the balance. President Harry Truman arrived with a new and secret advantage. News from Washington that the first atomic bomb test was imminent. Winston Churchill, the British Prime Minister, was eager for any development that might shorten the war. Joseph Stalin, calm and unreadable, said little about Japan, but pressed for recognition of Soviet claims in Eastern Europe and Asia. Officially, the conference was about coordinating final plans against Japan and laying the groundwork for peace. In reality, it was also a delicate dance of power. Truman and Churchill wanted Japan's surrender before the Soviets could enter the war. Stalin wanted time to move his armies across Asia and secure influence before hostilities ended. On July 16th, while talks continued, the Trinity test succeeded in the New Mexico desert. Truman received the news in Potsdam, his confidence shifting visibly. He hinted to Stalin that the United States had developed a weapon of unusual destructive force. Stalin, outwardly unfazed, already knew through his intelligence network exactly what Truman was referring to. The conference ended with the Potsdam Declaration, an ultimatum calling for Japan's unconditional surrender, warning of prompt and utter destruction if it refused. Japan's leaders rejected it. Behind the diplomatic language, the clock was ticking. The bomb was ready, the targets chosen, and the tension between wartime allies was turning into something colder. Before dawn on July 16, 1945, in the barren Jornada del Muerto desert of New Mexico, a tower stood alone against the darkness. At its top rested a strange metallic sphere, the world's first plutonium implosion bomb, codenamed the Gadget. Scientists, soldiers, and engineers waited miles away, some crouched in trenches, others peering through welders' goggles or from behind protective screens. J. Robert Oppenheimer stood among them, chain-smoking, eyes fixed on the horizon. They had calculated every variable, but no one could be certain what would happen when the detonators fired. At 5:29 a.m., the desert exploded into daylight. A searing white flash washed over the mountains, brighter than the sun, followed by a towering column of fire and smoke that ballooned into the now iconic mushroom cloud. The shockwave rolled across the desert floor, flattening the scrub and rattling bones. Some cheered. Others stood in stunned silence. Oppenheimer later recalled a line from Hindu scripture, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." General Leslie Groves simply said, "The war will be over." The test was a technical triumph and a moral turning point. The bomb worked. It could be delivered to a city, and it was ready for use. News of the success raced to Washington, then across the Atlantic to Truman in Potsdam. For some, it meant victory was now in sight. For others, it meant the world had crossed an irreversible threshold. The United States now held a weapon that could end the war in days, or change the course of human history forever. By late July 1945, the list of potential targets had been narrowed. Hiroshima sat at the top. On a military map, it was more than a city. It was a key node in Japan's war machine. It housed the headquarters of the Second General Army, a major military communications center, and supply depots supporting operations across southern Japan. Its port connected troop movements and shipments to the inland sea. From a planner's perspective, Hiroshima also had the ideal geography for demonstrating the bomb's power. Nestled between mountains and bisected by rivers, it offered natural containment that could magnify the blast's destructive force. It had not been heavily bombed before, meaning the effects would be unmistakable in both scale and clarity for post-strike analysis. On the map, these were strategic checkmarks. On the ground, Hiroshima was also a city of 300,000 civilians, shopkeepers, students, families, and thousands of schoolchildren conscripted into demolition work to clear fire breaks against future air raids. For the men in the Target Committee and the newly formed Interim Committee, such details rarely entered the conversation. The logic was that a shock had to be delivered, both to Japan and to any nation watching. A pristine, intact city would be the most effective canvas for that message. By the end of July, the decision was sealed. Hiroshima would be first. If Japan did not surrender after that, another city, Nagasaki, would follow. On August, doors went out. Specially modified B-29 bombers would carry the new weapons. Crews began training for a mission unlike any in history. The map was set. All that remained was to redraw it in fire. At 8:15 a.m. Sunim, on August 6, 1945, a single B-29 bomber, the Enola Gay, released its payload over Hiroshima. The bomb, Little Boy, drifted for 43 seconds before detonating 100 feet above the city's center. In that instant, a blinding white light seared across the landscape. Within a radius of 1 mile, temperatures soared to over 4,000 degrees Celsius, hot enough to melt steel and vaporize human beings. Shadows of people and objects were burned into walls and pavement. Skin blistered and sloughed off in sheets. Clothing burst into flames. The blast wave followed, flattening nearly every structure in the city. Bridges twisted. Streetcars derailed. Entire neighborhoods vanished into debris. Those caught in the open were thrown like rag dolls. Glass from shattered windows became deadly projectiles. For the survivors, the next minutes were a nightmare beyond comprehension. The air was thick with dust and smoke, pierced by the screams of the injured. Many staggered to the rivers, their skin hanging in strips, their eyes clouded with burns. Others lay still, unrecognizable, in the streets where they had fallen. Doctors and nurses who had survived found themselves overwhelmed within moments. Hospitals were destroyed. Medical supplies were gone. Thousands died untreated, their wounds festering in the summer heat. By nightfall, Hiroshima was a smoldering ruin. Somewhere between 70,000 and 80,000 people were dead, most in the first few seconds. Tens of thousands more would perish in the days and weeks that followed, from burns, injuries, and the strange, invisible sickness that no one yet understood. The city had been transformed into a vision of hell, and the war was still not over. Even as Hiroshima smoldered, preparations for the second strike were already in motion. U.S. military planners had decided early on that if Japan did not immediately surrender, a second bomb would be dropped in within days. The intent was clear: to demonstrate that the United States possessed not just one, but a stockpile of these new weapons, and the will to use them. The original target for the second attack was Kokura, home to a major arsenal and military industry. But on the morning of August 9, 1945, the B-29 Boxcar, carrying the plutonium bomb Fat Man, found Kokura shrouded in smoke and haze, some from industrial fires, some from a bombing raid on a nearby city the day before. After 3 failed bombing runs over Kokura, with fuel running dangerously low, the crew diverted to the secondary target, Nagasaki. Nagasaki was an industrial hub, home to the Mitsubishi shipyards and arms factories. Its hilly terrain meant the blast would be partially contained, but it also ensured that neighborhoods in the blast zone would be devastated. At 11:02 a.m., Fat Man detonated 1,650 feet above the city. The explosion was even more powerful than Hiroshima's, but the geography spared parts of Nagasaki from total destruction. Even so, some 40,000 people were killed instantly. By the end of the year, the death toll would approach 70,000. In Washington, the second strike was justified as necessary to force Japan's surrender. But in Tokyo, the shock was mixed with confusion and disbelief. Had the Americans truly developed a weapon capable of wiping out entire cities, one after another, in less than a week? The answer was becoming undeniable. News of Hiroshima's destruction had reached Tokyo slowly, filtered through the fragments of radio reports and military dispatches. Many in the government dismissed the early claims as exaggerations, until photographs and first-hand accounts began to arrive. Still, the scale was almost beyond belief. Then came Nagasaki. Within hours of the second bombing, it was no longer possible to doubt. 2 cities had been obliterated in less than a week, entire populations gone, infrastructure erased, survivors stricken with mysterious illnesses. Inside the Imperial Palace, the Supreme War Council met in urgent session. For days they had debated surrender terms, divided between those who insisted on fighting and those who saw no path forward. Now the arguments were sharpened by the reality that each passing day could bring another city's annihilation. Yet even in this moment, the council was deadlocked. Military leaders clung to the hope of extracting better terms, especially guarantees for the emperor's role after surrender. Others feared that total defeat would bring national humiliation and possibly revolution. Outside those chambers, Japan's people moved in stunned silence. Rail lines carried streams of burned and wounded refugees into already strained cities. Rumors spread about an atomic weapon, one unlike any in human history. No one yet knew the word radiation, but they saw its effects: hair falling out, skin blackening, fevers that killed without visible wounds. The silence was not just shock, it was exhaustion. Years of war, fire, and hunger had hollowed the nation. Now it stood on the edge, its leaders still unable to agree whether to step back or fall. On August 8, 1945, just 2 days after Hiroshima, Joseph Stalin made his move. The Soviet Union declared war on Japan, honoring its pledge from Yalta but timed to maximum advantage. Hours later, Soviet forces surged across the borders of Japanese-occupied Manchuria. The assault was massive and meticulously planned. Over 1 million Red Army troops poured into Manchuria from Siberia and Mongolia, backed by thousands of tanks, artillery pieces, and aircraft. Japanese defenses, already weakened by years of war and cut off from reinforcements, crumbled quickly under the onslaught. Simultaneously, Soviet forces invaded Sakhalin Island and prepared to advance into the Kuril Islands. Plans were even discussed for an amphibious landing on Hokkaido, the northernmost of Japan's home islands. For the United States, this was a dangerous development. If the Soviets managed to seize parts of Japan before the surrender, the occupation could mirror what had happened in Germany: divided zones, competing administrations, and the spread of communist influence. In Tokyo, the Soviet entry into the war shattered any remaining hope that Moscow might mediate a peace settlement. Japan now faced defeat on 2 fronts: the Americans with their unstoppable new bomb, and the Soviets with their unstoppable armies. For Truman and his advisors, the Soviet offensive was a reminder that the clock was almost out of time. Every day that passed increased the risk that the post-war map of Asia would bear Stalin's fingerprints. The bomb had been meant to shock Japan into surrender, but it was all too unmistakably a signal to the Soviet Union. Now, with both weapons and armies in motion, the race to end the war had entered its final, most perilous hours. In the humid heat of a Pacific Island airfield, American soldiers lounged in the shade of their tents, writing letters home or cleaning rifles that might soon be needed for the invasion of Japan. For weeks, rumors had swirled. Some said the war would drag on into next year, others that a super bomb was coming that could end it overnight. On August 6th, the news crackled over field radios. A single American plane had destroyed an entire Japanese city. The broadcast was brief, almost unbelievable. Men exchanged skeptical looks. "One plane? Wiped out a city? That's impossible," some muttered. But as the day wore on, details emerged. It was a new kind of weapon, unlike anything seen before. Photographs hadn't yet reached the front, but the language in the reports, utter destruction, obliterated, was enough to set imaginations reeling. 3 days later, the announcement came again. Another city gone, Nagasaki this time. The reaction was mixed. Some cheered, convinced the war was now in its final days. Others felt unease, wondering what kind of power could do such a thing, and what it meant for the future. For the men who had expected to storm Japan's beaches in a matter of weeks, it was a wave of relief. An invasion promised bloodshed on a scale few wanted to contemplate. If these bombs meant they could go home alive, few were inclined to question the details. Still, in the quiet moments between orders, the thought lingered. The war might be ending, but something entirely new had begun. Inside the Imperial Palace in Tokyo, the Supreme War Council convened in a room thick with cigarette smoke and tension. The news from Hiroshima had been shocking, Nagasaki, unthinkable. And now, the Soviet Union, Japan's last hope for mediation, had declared war and invaded Manchuria. Still, surrender was not a foregone conclusion. The council was split. The peace faction, led by Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo and supported by a few senior statesmen, argued that Japan must accept the Allies' terms before the nation was completely destroyed. The war faction, dominated by military leaders, insisted on continuing the fight, hoping for one decisive battle on Japanese soil to secure better terms, especially the preservation of the emperor's sovereignty. Intercepted communications revealed these divisions to U.S. intelligence. But, from Washington's perspective, the debate was dragging on too long. Every additional day risked more Soviet advances and further complications for the post-war settlement. Within the council, tempers flared. Some generals spoke of arming civilians with bamboo spears if necessary. Others pointed to the ruin of Hiroshima and Nagasaki as proof that the enemy would stop at nothing. Emperor Hirohito, silent through most of the meeting, was listening closely. Even as Japan's cities burned and its armies collapsed abroad, the struggle inside these closed chambers was as fierce as any fought on the battlefield. It was a battle of pride, survival, and fear of the unknown future that surrender would bring. The final decision would hinge on a single voice, one that had never before spoken directly in such matters. That voice would soon break the deadlock. In the weeks after the bombings, Hiroshima and Nagasaki became cities of the walking wounded. Those who had survived the initial blasts now faced an enemy they could not see. Hospitals lay in ruins, doctors and nurses killed or injured. Makeshift clinics sprang up in schoolhouses and temples, but supplies were scarce. No antibiotics, few bandages, little food. Burns covered vast portions of skin, wounds festered in the summer heat, and many victims suffered from dehydration after days without clean water. Then came the mysterious illnesses. People who had seemed unharmed on August 6th or 9th began to weaken. Hair fell out in clumps, mouths bled without injury. Fevers raged and strange purple spots bloomed on skin. Within days, many were dead. No one yet understood that these were the effects of radiation sickness. The survivors, the hibakusha, bore more than physical wounds. Social stigma soon followed. Many Japanese feared the sickness was contagious. Employers hesitated to hire those who had been in the blast zones. Women found themselves shunned in marriage because of fears they would bear sickly children. For years, their suffering was compounded by silence. Occupation authorities restricted reporting and photography of the bombings, controlling the narrative for both domestic and international audiences. The world would not see many of the most harrowing images until long after the war. In these shadowed streets, life went on. Shops reopened, children played, but the scars, both visible and hidden, marked the survivors forever. They had witnessed the birth of the nuclear age not as observers, but as its first casualties. When Japan's surrender finally came, the world's military and economic landscape shifted overnight. The United States emerged from the war, not just victorious, but economically ascendant. Its factories, untouched by bombing, had produced the arsenal that won the war and could now be turned toward peacetime goods. Its navy commanded the seas. Its air power could reach across the globe. And now it possessed a weapon unmatched by any other nation. For Washington's planners, this was more than a moment of triumph. It was the foundation of a new world order. The atomic bomb had ended the war in the Pacific, but it also positioned the United States as the central power in post-war diplomacy. Any negotiation, whether in Europe or Asia, now took place in the shadow of America's nuclear monopoly. Japan itself became a linchpin in this strategy. The U.S. occupation would rebuild the country into a stable, democratic, and capitalist ally, one that could serve as a counterweight to communist influence in Asia. That goal was only achievable because the war had ended quickly, before the Soviet Union could occupy any part of the Japanese home islands. This balance of power was fragile. American leaders knew the Soviet Union would not remain without nuclear weapons for long. The question was not if, but when, the arms race would begin. For the moment, however, the United States stood at the peak of its power, economically unchallenged, militarily dominant, and holding a weapon that could command both fear and influence across the globe. The nuclear age had begun, and America was its sole master, for now. In the weeks after Japan's surrender, the official U.S. narrative of the bombings took shape with remarkable speed. Public statements from President Truman and military leaders emphasized one point above all. The atomic bomb had ended the war and saved countless American lives by avoiding an invasion of Japan's home islands. This version of events was clear, simple, and persuasive. It fit perfectly with the public mood, a nation exhausted by war, grieving its losses, and eager to believe that the sacrifice had brought not just victory, but mercy for those who might otherwise have died in battle. Details about Japan's internal debates, the Soviet entry into the war, and the possibility that surrender might have been near were largely absent from this story. The geopolitical message to Moscow, the subtext that had guided some of the decision-making, was never mentioned to the public. Newsreels showed triumphant headlines and cheering crowds. Photographs of the mushroom cloud became symbols of victory. Images of burned and dying civilians were rarely printed in American newspapers, and when they were often stripped of context or sanitized to minimize the horror. In schools, the lesson was straightforward. The atomic bomb was the necessary final act of World War II. It was portrayed as a technological achievement and a moral choice justified by the lives it saved. Over time, this narrative became deeply embedded in American memory, shaping how generations understood the end of the war. The more complicated truth, the overlapping motives, the shadow of the Cold War, remained in archives and memoirs, waiting for historians to piece it together decades later. The war ended on August 15, 1945. Emperor Hirohito's voice, carried over scratchy radio speakers, told the Japanese people that the nation must endure the unendurable. For the first time in history, the voice of the emperor reached ordinary citizens, his words breaking centuries of imperial distance. In the United States, streets erupted in celebration. Soldiers danced with strangers, church bells rang, and headlines screamed peace. For millions, it was a moment of relief so deep it seemed to wash away the years of rationing, worry, and grief. The atomic bomb was credited with delivering that moment, and few questioned the cost. But history rarely stays simple. In the decades that followed, layers of the decision would be examined, debated, and contested. Scholars uncovered the intelligence reports hinting at Japan's willingness to negotiate. They noted the timing of the Soviet declaration of war and the race to end the conflict before Stalin could stake a claim in Asia. They traced the discussions in Washington that weighed not only the destruction of Japan, but the demonstration of U.S. power to the world. For the survivors, the hibakusha, the legacy was more personal. They lived with the physical scars, the illnesses brought on by radiation, and the memories of cities turned to ash. Their testimonies forced the world to confront the human reality behind the mushroom cloud. Children wandering alone through ruins, mothers carrying burned infants, the silence of streets where no one remained alive to cry out. The Cold War that followed ensured the bomb's shadow never faded. The Soviet Union tested its own nuclear weapon in 1949, ending America's monopoly and beginning an arms race that would define global politics for the next half-century. In that race, Hiroshima and Nagasaki were not just memories, they were warnings. Today the debate continues. Was the atomic bomb the only way to end the war without an invasion? Or was it a calculated geopolitical move, aimed as much at Moscow as at Tokyo? Perhaps it was both, a decision born of desperation, ambition, and the desire to shape the post-war world before anyone else could. What cannot be debated is the scale of the change it unleashed. The morning of August 6, 1945, marked more than the destruction of a city. It marked the moment humanity stepped into a new era, one in which a single weapon could erase an entire population in seconds. The real reason the United States dropped the atomic bomb was never just Japan. It was about the end of one war and the beginning of another. It was about who would hold the power when the smoke cleared and how the future would be drawn in the ashes of the present. And so the story closes where it began, in the blinding flash over Hiroshima, a light so bright it turned morning into day, yet cast a shadow that still stretches across the world. The atomic bomb ended a war, but it also began an age defined by fear and restraint. It gave victory to one side, but no true security to any. In its wake came treaties, rivalries, and a global understanding that some weapons cannot be used without endangering all. The people of Hiroshima and Nagasaki became the first witnesses to a truth that would haunt the modern age. Humanity's greatest achievement in destructive power could also be its undoing. And in the quiet after the blast, amid the rubble and the silence, history was no longer about who had won or lost, but about whether, in the end, anyone truly could.